Hey, welcome everyone to the regulatory track of the AV portion of the conference. And I am Elliot Katz from the law firm of DLA Piper. I lead our autonomous vehicle practice where I focus on privacy, policy, and regulatory issues. And with me today, I have some very esteemed panelists who will introduce themselves now.
Hi, my name is Dr. Lance Elliott, formerly a professor at the University of Southern California, USC, where I established one of the pioneering AI research laboratories. I'm a serial entrepreneur, having started, ran, and sold 3 high-tech businesses. My latest business is called Techbrium, and our play is in the AI and safety space, and specifically with respect to self-driving cars. Some of you came up to me and talked to me about my book called AI Guardian Angel Bots for Deep AI Trustworthiness, which talks about the topic of AI safety and self-driving cars. So I'm excited to be here today to help cover that and any other topics in the autonomous vehicle self-driving car space.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Annabelle Chang. I'm the Director of Public Policy for Lyft. We are the fastest growing rideshare in the country, and how we fit into the AV world is that we believe that the first time you ever ride in an autonomous car will be through the Lyft platform. It'll be the easiest, most accessible, convenient, and well-priced way to get an AV car. Thank you.
And my name is Mark Berman. I'm a California State Assembly member for the 24th Assembly District, which includes northern Santa Clara County and southern San Mateo County, including Mountain View, Palo Alto, Sunnyvale, Menlo Park, and a lot of the surrounding communities. Before that, I served on the Palo Alto City Council, and during that time, I gave a TEDx talk on autonomous vehicles from the perspective of a city council member and the potential they have for reducing traffic and increasing much more efficient land use policies.
Great. So obviously we're here today to talk about AV regs, but I'm going to start it off with a question that could make this very, very short. I don't think it will, but the first question is essentially, when the original automobile hit public roads, there was no DOT, there was no NHTSA, there was no ability to regulate that space on the front end. And so here, do you guys believe that autonomous vehicle regulations are needed? And if so, why or why not?
Yeah, I think what we're going to see, what I've been predicting, and I also write a column called the AI Insider column for AI Trends, is in the next 3 years, we're going to see a tremendous amount of lawsuits. You may have seen just 2 weeks ago the lawsuit against Tesla for their Autopilot 2.0, with various claims about that in terms of its supposedly being drunken in its behavior. We've been very lucky so far. The way I look at this space with self-driving cars, it's almost like a Uber kind of thing right now. No regulator really wants to attack it because it's got that glow to it of something very exciting in the future. But my prediction is, in the next 18 months, unfortunately, we're going to see some circumstances with self-driving cars where they get into a terrible accident, and the regulators are going to realize they're going to have to step in. So I'm predicting that we're going to see a lot of regulation stepping into this area that right now is very light.
So from my perspective, the train has left the station in terms of regulations. So in 2017 alone, we've had more than 20 states actually start having autonomous vehicle legislation being discussed in this very early stage, and several states already have in place autonomous vehicle regulations. So I think it's 5 states have had it before 2017. The state of Michigan has been added in this last year, and it is currently being actively debated in many different legislatures. Our strong preference, of course, is that cars, by its very nature, pass state lines, right? So from California to Nevada, Nevada to Arizona, et cetera. And so what really makes sense is actually a national framework, such as the US DOT NHTSA model, because of the very nature, even not just a passenger vehicle, but when we get to the discussion of trucking, that becomes an interstate commerce issue. So what we look at right now is the NHTSA guidelines that have come out, I think are very, very good I think, very good standard that's been set. But we do have to recognize that there are states actively moving towards regulation, and even some cities actively looking towards regulation. And that, I think, is going to be potentially very problematic, because what you don't want is to go from Palo Alto to Mountain View and have to switch cars, right? So that's something that we definitely have to think about.
No, I think that's absolutely right. And I think I have kind of two thoughts. One is I really hope that there's good regulation put in place before a huge accident, because I think if there isn't, then you are going to see regulators, lawmakers racing to introduce bills that are going to set the industry back. Exactly. And that's really problematic, and something that I think none of us here want to see. But I also think that I look at it from the perspective of everybody here is probably an early adopter, or considers themselves an early adopter of technology, but there's still the 90% of society that isn't, and they need to have some confidence that the technology is safe, or else that's also going to kind of set up hurdles to the deployment of the technology. And so I think regulation has a role in giving society the confidence that the technology is safe and that people can use it. It's just that obviously, we want to make sure that the regulation isn't overly burdensome,
right,
and doesn't stall the innovation. So it's a fine line that I think California got off on the wrong foot on initially, and I think the current draft of DMV regulations is much better than earlier versions. But it's also taken 2.5 or 3 years longer than they planned, which isn't ideal for industry. So.
And I think as well, Elliot, what it raises is a international competitiveness question. I'm less familiar with what other countries are doing, but certainly people are racing to be the leader in this field. So where if regulations here start slowing down the technological advancements of US companies, I certainly think that other foreign companies will begin to take the lead.
Mm-hmm.
I'll just kind of add, too, that the public perception, I just wrote about a poll that was done. They keep doing surveys of what do consumers think of self-driving cars. And one of the latest ones shows that the percentage has increased of consumers that feel they would not be safe inside a self-driving car. It's between 60 to 80% right now of consumers that are surveyed that say that. Part of the reason they say that is when you see YouTube videos of a self-driving car on the streets that's part of this kind of grand experiment that we're doing right now with self-driving cars, and it runs a red light, or it veers towards a pedestrian, that gets a big social media attention and mass media attention, and that gives consumers some pause for thought. Now, I actually appreciate that, because many of the automakers that are developing the software are principally focused on getting the car to drive. They're not as focused on the defensive aspects of the driving and the safety aspects of the driving. That's kind of like almost an afterthought. First, let's just get the car to drive with AI and see what we do after that. And that's why I'm pushing very hard to try to make sure that safety is there day one. In fact, if you look at the most of the open source software for self-driving cars, which I've gone through and written quite a bit about, there's almost nothing in there related to safety aspects. It's all about how to follow a line, how to follow a car ahead of you, but very little in there related to the safety aspects. So I'm just saddened to think that we're sitting right now, kind of sitting ducks in the self-driving car arena, that we're waiting for some crisis to occur, and the effects it could have on this industry would be very sad.
Yeah, and we've seen whether it was from the AVs running red lights, or the one case of the Uber driver that died last year, I think it was.
Yes.
100 people die every day on California roads. Yeah. 94 of them due to human error, but that doesn't get the attention. That doesn't get nearly the attention that did the accident with the AV. Or, gosh, I have no idea how many red lights are run every day. Yeah. It's probably 1 million. But the bar is so high,
right,
I think, for AVs, rightly or wrongly, and so it really behooves industry to put safety first, and I think a lot of good actors are, so that something catastrophic doesn't happen that really stalls progress.
And I'll just kind of segue off of that. So the Tesla incident from last year, where the driver was in the car, the autopilot did not recognize that there was a truck next to it. It made a maneuver into the truck, ended up killing the driver. You probably saw that the federal investigation basically cleared this by saying, well, it was the driver's responsibility. And that, of course, that's what Tesla also says, and most of the other self-driving car makers say, well, look, it's driver assisted, the driver is still responsible for the car. Two issues with that I'll just share with the group that I didn't hear earlier that I think are important to realize. One is that there's a lot of cognitive studies that show, beyond any question, first of all, the cognitive dissonance of you're in the driver's seat and the car is being driven by some AI system, the gap between your awareness of what is going on with the car and the car actually entering into a circumstance where it suddenly hands control back over to you. Most studies show it takes the average human about 4 to 6 seconds as a minimum to cognitively recognize a particular circumstance, let alone then move their limbs to steer the car or brake the car or press on the accelerator, which can take easily another 5 to 10 seconds. When you're talking about a car going 70 miles an hour on an open highway that's veering towards another vehicle or another vehicle into it, you don't have that length of time. Think of the distance that you're going at that speed and how quickly things happen. So this concept that we have of, oh, well, the human is responsible for driving the car if the AI system somehow figures out, oh, it can't handle it and just hand it over to the human, it's a very problematic issue because of that cognitive dissonance and also the reaction time required to respond to it.
Yeah, so just a couple reactions to a couple of things we just heard from our panelists. First of all, I completely agree with Mark. A lot of people, not so much now, but maybe a year or two ago, said, hey, we really shouldn't have regulations in this space right now because we need to allow this technology that's really still in its infancy to grow and we don't know where things are going to go. But I totally agree with Mark that if this is just thought of as the wild, wild west, the driving public will not buy in. And currently 1.2 million people are dying each year. So we need the driving public to buy into this new idea of autonomous vehicles. A couple other points. A point, Lance, that you made that there's already been certain crashes. By the way, these crashes are often misconstrued in the media as a self-driving car crash. There has not been a self-driving car crash. The crashes are level 2 vehicles, which are very, very far away from being, say, a level 5 vehicle. These are advanced driver assistance systems. But you're absolutely right. On the day that one of these crashes takes place, that's all you hear on CNN and every major media outlet, when the reality is that there was 2,999 other fatal accidents that exact same day that received little to zero coverage. The last thing is, Lance, you mentioned in terms of level 3, where the driver actually has to take control of the vehicle. NHTSA has actually run tests on that. You said 4 to 6 seconds, and this is shocking, but this is from NHTSA, the regulator in the space, found that it can take upwards of 17 seconds for the driver to regain control of the vehicle. So I agree with Lance. Even 4 to 6 seconds is bad, but 17 seconds is probably 16 and a half seconds too late. So anyways, we alluded to a couple of things there that I wanted to hit on now. Obviously, California's DMV just rolled out another iteration of their autonomous vehicle regs in March. And I think probably most of us on this panel, at least, will be in agreement that they have slowly but surely moved in the right direction. However, I want to get a sense, first of all, about what you guys think about what California has done. And secondly, do you believe that these states now are in any way competing with one another when they roll out these regs?
If I could just real quick respond to the point about the 17 seconds. Yeah, so just to clarify, so that 4 to 6 seconds that I was referring to, that's simply the time required to realize, to mentally realize that something is afoot. That is not the time involved to then take action. And the action also has to be based on some kind of plan. So mentally you have to plan what to do next once you realize that there is a problem. Then you have to move your hands or your feet, if you've taken them off the steering wheel or feet away from the pedals, you have to move them to the pedals and then take some kind of action. So the 17 seconds I completely agree with. In fact, I'd say it's probably even longer than that. The other aspect is the question of the communication between the car and the human driver. Because if the car just suddenly says, hey, I'm handing the car to you, and you have no idea why, is that because it recognized a tire up ahead? Is that because another car is veering into it? Is it because your car itself is failing in some fashion? If you don't even know that, you don't even have an idea of what approach to take to it. So one of the things that we have to start looking at is the communication between the car and the human driver in these assisted situations, to somehow share with the driver what the status of the car is and what recommendation or state that it should go into. So I just wanted to kind of further address that. So I'll now turn over to my colleagues on the California question.
Yeah, and that's a good question, Elliot. I think in terms of states, right, some of the best examples are actually happening not just in California, but actually one of our neighboring states in Arizona. Arizona has become one of the hotbeds of AV testing and technology, and several companies are already testing there in the state of Arizona, and that's partly because Governor Ducey has taken a very, I would say, liberal approach to how testing can be done and how AVs can develop in their state. So he went ahead and issued an executive order. So instead of there being state legislation in place, there's actually the flexibility of an executive order. So that's I think a very interesting point. In the state of California, however, we took a different tact, which is that we had legislation pass back in, I think it was in 2012. I actually don't quite recall the date. 2012. So one of the first movers in this space. But since 2012, the AV industry has changed so significantly. So for example, how we fathom currently having DMV permits for AV testing did not contemplate the new joint ventures that are taking place throughout the country and throughout the world. So for example, Lyft is partnered up with General Motors for rolling out AV technology, but there are many other competitors in this space that have become joint ventures. And one of the questions, for example, for the DMV is who gets the permit? Who is permitted? And right now, there's only one permit holder, even if there are joint ventures. So from 2012 until now, there has already been a huge sea change in how the technology is being approached from a business competitive landscape to actually how the technology is even rolling out. So that's kind of an interesting thing. And I think the DMV workshops and the California DMV has recognized some of those very significant changes in its last round, and we are very pleased to see how far they've come, but I think there's even more opportunity to even improve on that.
And I mean, that's a great point from Annabelle, and just iterates the importance of flexibility, and kind of a flexible framework because we can't anticipate what the technology of 2 years from now is even going to be, and we need to make sure that the regulatory framework achieves our goals of safety and those types of things, but also allows for the flexibility of the inevitable morphing and different models that are going to be created in AV space and others. And so, and I do think we are competing with other states, and it's competing for good jobs. We don't talk enough about the jobs that are being created, not just by the engineers that are developing the technology, but then you have, I've kind of been surprised to find how many jobs there are just in terms of test drivers who are test driving the technology in my district, in Mountain View, or on Stanford campus or elsewhere. And so it is a detriment to us if we don't create an atmosphere that encourages companies to test their product here. And we have a built-in advantage of being California and just the workforce that we have and all these types of things, but we can't take that for granted. And I think folks are starting to realize that.
And an interesting point to that too is, California is the ideal place in Arizona for testing because of our weather is so great, and obviously in here in Silicon Valley we have new roads, big roads, wide roads, et cetera. But as the technology develops, we're going to have autonomous vehicles that can be tested in inclement weather, right? In snowy conditions, in rainy conditions, and some of those states, like the state of Michigan, are probably going to be very competitive in that field.
And thank you for that. And I'd like just to add that a couple things quickly to your comment as well. That a lot of people ask me about self-driving cars. That's a very ambiguous indication. You have to be clear if it's a level 5 car that you're referring to, level 4, level 3. There's a standard that the Society of Automotive Engineers had come out with, which now has become kind of accepted, of different levels of self-driving cars. A 5 is a self-driving car that can completely be driven by the automation without any human involvement, and furthermore, that the car has to be able to drive as well as a human could drive. That means in all circumstances that a human could drive. As to your point before, there are no level 5 cars today. And so that's one of the things when people say to me, Lance, what do you think of self-driving cars? Well, the first thing I start with, well, just keep in mind there is no level 5 today. But the consumers don't necessarily realize that, and to the point earlier about public perception. Now to California, so the regs for California is one of the most progressive, the DMV is most progressive related to self-driving cars. Keep in mind that then when I say self-driving cars, I'm talking about a level 2 or level 3 that's a driver-assisted kind of car. One of the aspects of that, though, they're very progressive in comparison to a lot of the other states, but even there, one of the things I've commented on is if you look at the reports that are required to be produced by those that get a permit to have their self-driving car on our public streets, so we as the public should want to know, well, how well are those cars performing? One of the things that they have to report is an indication of how many incidents that they've had of the human in the car, the engineer, having to take over control of the car. But unfortunately, if you look at that, the reports so far are kind of nebulous because they didn't really define distinctly when you have to report it and what the nature of the circumstance was that they took back control of the car. So I've been kind of critical of that I think we need something more definitive than that. But at the same time, I've been complimentary to California. They're one of the few states that even has such a requirement, which I think is very helpful for the public to know what is the status of these cars that are on our public streets.
Yeah, and a couple things. First of all, to go off what Lance just said with the disengagement reports, there's another, I would say, issue there as well because it's not clear where these vehicles are being driven, right? If you're just taking laps around the 49ers parking lot and you do that 1,000 times in a row and you rack up however many miles, that's very different than driving, say, in San Francisco over a varied terrain. To Annabelle's point earlier, a couple things as well. I think that I'm not a huge fan of politicians using Twitter, but when this first happened...
So I won't tweet out this panel.
If you haven't already. But when there was an issue with ride-sharing, autonomous ride-sharing in San Francisco, Governor Ducey immediately stepped in via Twitter and said, hey, everyone's welcome here in sunny Arizona. And so I think that was a very calculated play on his part, but we can debate whether what they're doing is the correct way to roll this out or not, but it obviously worked, right? Now you have Uber in Arizona, you also have Waymo in Arizona. To another point that Annabelle made about competition between the states, the California DMV just rolled out their proposed regulations in March. An earlier draft of those regs basically stated that even with fully autonomous vehicles, you had to have a licensed human sitting in the driver's seat ready to take control, which obviously defeats the point of a driverless vehicle. And shortly after California did that, Michigan came in. And Michigan, by the way, was very worried about losing their stake in the auto industry at this point in time. And they issued regs that said, nope, you don't need a driver at all. You don't need a licensed driver. So that's just another example of these states seeing the opportunity here, both from a life-saving standpoint, a mobility standpoint, but also an economic standpoint for citizens in their state.